Welcome, everyone. My name is Justine Andrews. I'm the director of the Institute for Medieval Studies here at UNM. It's just wonderful to have you with us online for the 35th annual Institute for Medieval Studies Spring Lecture Series. And this year, the topic is medieval performance. We, of course, look forward to a time when we can meet together in person, but we continue to be connected to our home here at the University of New Mexico. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits in the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. This year, we remember our history and commemorate a new beginning in the renaming of our event. Our founder of the Institute passed away 1 year ago. Helen Damico was dedicated to connecting scholars to share their work with us. She was also deeply invested in her students and the community, and of course, the study of the Middle Ages. She was an exceptional scholar, dedicating her research to Old Norse and Old English literature, especially the epic Beowulf. Her contributions forged a path for later female medievalists and for the study of women in historical and fictional literature. We remember Helen for her spirit, her tenacity to build this institute and found this lecture series, her enlightening scholarship, and her delightful presence. And so we rename this series tonight the Helen Damico Memorial Lecture Series. Because the series was postponed from last year and we are hosting it online this year as a series of webinars, our fundraising structure was upended. But I still want to thank all the departments and administrative units who have continually supported and encouraged the IMS and this event. And I must thank our previous director, Dr. Timothy Graham, for laying much of the groundwork for this event. I thank too my cherished medieval colleagues who make up the IMS steering committee for all their assistance and encouragement. And finally, I must thank all the students and the Friends of Medieval Studies, and everyone in our audience. It is to you that Helen wished the ideas, excitement, and intrigue of the Middle Ages to be spread. I hope that your imaginations will be sparked and you will keep coming back for events that engage you with the complexities of the Middle Ages. And of course, coming back for our subsequent lectures in this series tomorrow night at 5:30 p.m. and then next week, Thursday and Friday. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate and how to best view this event. At any time during the webinar, you have the opportunity to submit questions through the Q&A function. To do so, you just type in your question into that Q&A at the bottom of your control panel. It should be at the bottom of your screen, not the chat. I don't believe that's there, but the Q&A form. And as time allows, presenters will address as many questions as you can during the Q&A session at the end of our lecture. We'll also be recording this webinar and sharing the link over YouTube on our YouTube channel and also on our website in the coming weeks. So thank you again so much for being here. Thank you to Carol Symes for being here as our wonderful guest lecturer. And I'm going to hand over the screen now to Dr. Michael Ryan, my dear colleague from History Department, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Ryan.
Thank you, Professor Andrews, and thanks to all of you who have chosen to attend this evening's presentation. I hope this introduction finds each of you safe and well from wherever you may be presently joining us. I am Dr. Michael A. Ryan, an Associate Professor of Medieval History at the University of New Mexico, And it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to begin the inaugural Helen Damico Memorial Lecture Series by introducing our first invited speaker, Professor Carol Symes. Dr. Symes is an associate professor of history, theater, medieval studies, and classics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and is North America's leading expert on medieval theater and its modes of performance. Dr. Symes earned her BA in Humanities from Yale College, graduating cum laude and with distinction in the major. Holding her PhD in history from Harvard and the MLit degree in history from Oxford, she is also a member of Actors' Equity and has trained as a professional actor at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School in England. She is also the recipient of a certificate in stage combat from the Society of British Fight Directors. Her exquisite book, A Common Stage, Theatre and Public Life in Medieval Arras, published by Cornell University Press in 2007, has garnered 4 major awards: the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize from the American Historical Association, the John Nicholas Brown Prize from the Medieval Academy of America, the David S. Pinkney Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies, and the David Bevington Prize from the Medieval and Renaissance Drama Society. She's also the editor of numerous important journals and volumes, and the founding executive editor of the Medieval Globe, billed as the first academic journal to promote a global approach to medieval studies. Its inaugural double issue published the Open Access and Paradigm Shifting Study, edited by Dr. Monica Green, Pandemic Disease in the Medieval World, Rethinking the Black Death. Dr. Symes is working on a couple of additional projects at present, centering her research on the histories of communication and transmission. Her current book project, Mediated Texts and Their Makers in Medieval Europe, analyzes the material conditions and embodied uses of writing, the give and take among multiple genres of documentation and multiple literacies, and the fundamental influence of performance on the making and meanings of medieval texts. Dr. Symes' work reveals that many non-elite historical actors were involved in negotiating, drafting, disseminating, and interpreting the many sources that we in the present rely upon for our knowledge of the past. This project has been supported by a Burkhardt Fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and a residency at the National Humanities Center in 2013-14, as well as a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Another ongoing project, Modern War in the Medieval Past, the Middle Ages of World War I, explores the ways that ideas, monuments, and landscapes associated with the Middle Ages were sentimentalized, targeted, destroyed, and revived before, during, and after the Great War. Finally, her new research looks at how the experience of incarceration shaped Shakespeare's actors, audiences, and plays. It grows out of the lessons that she learned while teaching and performing Shakespeare's plays at the Danville Correctional Center, a medium maximum security state prison for men. She subsequently founded the Education Justice Project's Theater Initiative and directed a full-length production of The Tempest in April of 2013. In addition to her many professional accomplishments and laurels, Professor Carol Symes is just a spectacular person, and it is a true honor to have her here with us. Please join me then in giving the warmest of welcomes to Dr. Symes, whose presentation, The Many Spaces of Medieval Theater, will discuss the widely disparate ways in which drama was performed, from the fall of the Roman Empire until the construction of the first professional playhouses in the 15th century. Dr. Symes.
Mike, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm blushing. So I'm sitting here in my home. No one can see me, but I'm still blushing. So thank you very much. It's such a delight. Thank you so much, Justine, for this invitation, and to Timothy Graham for putting this together a couple of years ago. It's such a pleasure, even virtually, to get to spend time with fellow scholars and members of the community there. I'm very sad that I am not visiting in person, and it's also a tremendous honor to be invited to speak to you today at this inaugural event for the Helen Damico Memorial Lecture Series. It's really a pretty extraordinary thing. So I'll trust Drs. Ryan and Andrews to interrupt if something goes wrong technically, but I'm hoping that you can see my screen there. I'll keep going in case you can't. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the many spaces of medieval theater, both physical spaces and also conceptual spaces, literary spaces, the various ways in which we access knowledge about the performance culture of the medieval past. And my slide here is showing you actually an 18th century model of the medieval town of Arras, which was the subject of a book I wrote a number of years ago and still very dear to my heart, as well as some texts and a particular artifact that I'll be talking about in a second. And what these represent for me are the various ways in which we as scholars and as devotees of the Middle Ages need to learn to make space for medieval theater in these various venues, in the way that we put the Middle Ages into the larger history of theater. And I would venture a guess that for many people, the idea that there actually is theater in the Middle Ages might come as a surprise. How we make space for that in studying what goes on in ecclesiastical spaces, and of course in the community, but also, you know, within the textual artifacts that convey information in various ways about medieval performance practices. And it's really wonderful that you're going to hear from historians of art, of dance, and also of theater and modern theater, sort of contemporary ways of practicing medieval theater in the lectures that follow. So let me start with the ways that medieval theater has been misunderstood in the larger history of theater. And this is allied to the way that it is often associated with the medieval church. So, what was medieval theater according to these older narratives? I'm showing you here a bas-relief from a monastery in Germany, which is now in Cologne, which is showing you an artistic representation of a particular medieval drama, the Visitatio Sepulchre, the visit to the sepulchre of the three Marys on Easter morning, when they are confronted by the angel sitting on the tomb of the risen Christ. And this a drama associated with this particular liturgical moment has often been, has been for centuries held up as the first artifact of medieval theater. It comes from a famous set of directives issued by the Anglo-Saxon Bishop Ethelwald of Winchester in 970, in which he gives instructions for how this Easter liturgy should be performed. And this is also known as the quem quaeritis, from the central question that the angel asks of the women: whom do you seek in the sepulchre, O followers of Christ? And one of the things I wanted to pay attention here is that when Ethelwald scripts this dramatic moment that's supposed to happen in the church on Easter morning, he is also trying to control the way that it's being performed. Notice all of the vocabulary of should, that the brother wearing an alb playing the angel should come in as though intent on other business, because he's an angel, right? And should sit quietly, that the three, in this case, the three monks, the three men playing the three Marys, should walk slowly and haltingly as though they're timid women coming in the dark to visit the cemetery. His insistence that these things should be done in this particularly decorous way, because these are biblical events. The angel should sing sweetly, in a moderate voice. So the very first moment when we encounter a script, essentially, for a medieval theatrical performance, it's full of very strict instructions about the way that this particular theatrical event should be realized. And to me, this stands in rather stark contrast to this particular sculpture, which shows us that the guys playing these three Marys, in this particular church in Germany, are not really making too much of an effort to disguise the fact that they're three guys. You know, they've kind of got stubble on their faces. They've got like beer bellies. You know, they are not following. You know, maybe they're trying to follow Ethelwald's instructions, but they're going to do this theater, you know, in their own imperfect ways with their own embodied presences. You know, no matter what happens. But the fact that, you know, Ethelwald as a bishop, as a churchman, was so insistent upon the decorous performance of medieval theater has, for at least a century, if not more, led scholars, both of medieval theater and also of its ancient predecessors and its early modern successors, to assume that if there was theater in the Middle Ages, it was pretty damn boring, and that moreover the medieval church would have succeeded on sort of crushing anything that was fun out of it. So for example, a classicist called Stephen Hallowell, in a book published a decade or so ago, opined that the anti-gelastic tendencies of Christianity, and I love this really scientific word for meaning anti-laughter. So that's one way to squeeze a bunch of fun out of something, is call it anti-gelastic. The anti-gelastic tendencies of Christianity contribute to a long medieval inheritance in which laughter continues to count from a theological point of view as a deeply troubling feature of mankind's fallen state. So here's a classicist telling us that the problem with the Middle Ages is that even if they did have theater, it could not possibly have been entertaining in any way. But in fact, if we remember those very, you know, kind of normal human bodies of those guys performing the Visit to the Sepulchre in Germany, and we compare it to other medieval artifacts, which openly actually make fun of the Visit to the Sepulchre and hold up this most sacred moment of sacred history, the discovery of the empty tomb of the risen Christ, and hold it up to laughter. This is the conclusion of a 13th century fabliau. A fabliau, as many of you know, is a salacious medieval story, often involving sexual misconduct or scatological humor, and this one has both of those things in it. And it's meant to mimic the language of a medieval a charter. So it has an opening clause: "Be it known to all those who are and who aren't anymore, who never should have been." That's meant to be funny. That there has been one great big pace, which in Old French means a fart. So, but there's a word play here between fart and peace, paix, in French, made between King Harry of England and Louis of Paris. And this charter, says the scribe, "I will hang my seal behind this charter with my arse," the seal of the barons of England. And this is a reference to a very well-known jongleur-esque joke that the act of sealing a document officially with a blob of wax and a seal is often reckoned as the act of, you know, pooping or the act of farting. You know, this is like, haha, this is like standard medieval humor, and it's being applied here to this charter. And then you notice the charter goes on to have this very elaborate dating clause, very similar to a charter, in which it dates it to the year 1200 on this Thursday, holy last Friday, at the hour when Marie Mazalene, which is basically Mad Bad Mary, took herself to the Holy Sepulchre shamefully, and Mad Bad Mary has a conversation with the angel, and the angel answers in a way that I'm sure Ethelwald would have been scandalized by, saying, "Alloo, alloo," not alleluia, but alloo, alloo. Jesus is not here. He has gone this morning to not Galilee, but Galerie, which is sort of like, you know, like, woohoo, ecstasy. He's gone somewhere. So any real look at the medieval documentary record that records the ways that medieval people enjoyed themselves suggests that this idea that medieval people did not know how to laugh and couldn't have enjoyed theater even if they had it is ridiculous. We can even look at the archives of real documents that are real charters and find that they contain plenty of theatrical activity, theatrical moments. This is a document that exists in an archive in northern France, which concludes with probably a spontaneously composed poem by the jongleur, the entertainer, who is being given this receipt for wages. So it begins in a very conventional fashion to all those seeing and hearing these letters. That's a very standard formula. Paris Foss, Pierre the Fool, greets you. Know that we have received from the bailiff of Hesdin castle for our wages at Christmas time. These nine days of Christmas, and then he goes of certain sum, and then he concludes by saying, "En quel témoignage je que n'y suis pas sage, on se laisse page dans mon sel à formage," given in the year of grace 1300. So, so here we have to imagine that this performer, standing in line with a bunch of other household servants of a particular person, this in this case is Count Robert of Artois, is taking this opportunity to give a performance in which he is referencing this same joke that, setting here a big cheese is, is basically, I'm going to put my seal on this thing and seal it, just like that joke that we saw in at the end of the Fabliaux. And I should say this is Paris Foss's seal, and you notice he represents himself as a jongleur with a cap and bells. I'm showing you here another seal of one of his companions in this particular household, which is a medieval jongleur who has taken the juggler's baton, and he's put them on a heraldic shield as though he's like an aristocratic nobleman. So here are guys who are not wasting any space for medieval theater. They're making space for medieval theater wherever they are. And that's really the burden of my talk today, is that the absence of purpose-built structures for theater in medieval Europe. We do not have things called theaters with proscenium arches and stages. And the beauty of that is that theater happens everywhere and anywhere in this world. It happens in every conceivable public space, private space, and it also happens in the space of the act of telling a story, or the act of going to the church, or the act of committing documents to writing. But you're thinking, well, I've been told that, in the Middle Ages, the rich dramatic traditions of antiquity were completely stamped out. Isn't that something that we should be paying attention to? And this is a very, very powerful narrative. So I'm another scholar of ancient theater. In this case, gives us the party line here. Considered, as Robert Garland says, considered with the general decline of the performing arts, which dates from the early Byzantine age, so both in the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire and in the Latin-speaking West. As he says, no Greek drama, as far as we know, was performed on a stage throughout this long period. So for Professor Garland, unless you're performing it on a stage, it's not theater. He goes on to say, precisely what function plays served in the schools is impossible to determine. Most students, however, would have studied only set speeches and set scenes. Very few can have had the expertise or staying power to read a whole play. The situation in the West, meanwhile, was understandably much bleaker. Okay, so this is the most negative possible picture of the very sad, colorless, boring world that whether you are a Greek-speaking schoolboy in Byzantium or a person living in the medieval Latin West, this is a very, very sad and depressing world. And we can kind of sum up this narrative that I have spent quite a bit of time debunking in my scholarship in the last decade or so. That essentially the case of posterity versus the Middle Ages is that the Middle Ages was responsible for the death of ancient theater. That the church, the medieval church, whether the Roman Church or the Orthodox Church in Byzantium, somehow successfully censors entertainment of every kind. That only when plays are fully staged on real stages in real theaters, that's the only time that you have theater. Medieval people are uniquely stupid. This is my least favorite of these assumptions. Like, again, the idea that it's only medieval school children who have trouble like reading a whole play, that information about performance is always going to be conveyed through texts, when practically speaking, most performers in our own day, never mind the Middle Ages, learn their craft from other performers. They don't learn it from reading books. And then finally, this expectation that the idea is that the Middle Ages is supposed to be in stasis. In other words, it's the job of the Middle Ages to take the rich traditions of antiquity and convey them absolutely unchanged to the modern world and not do anything interesting on their own. And I reject this, I bust this myth, I reject this narrative entirely. And I'm going to give you a different type of way of thinking about medieval theater here. So first of all, just practically speaking, the only reason why we have any Greek and Roman drama to study is because medieval scribes preserved it. We have the comedies of the Roman playwright Terence, active in the 2nd century before the Common Era, because they were assiduously copied in the Middle Ages. I'm showing you here a Carolingian manuscript of Terence's comedies. This is the Vatican Terence. That, you know, if we didn't have manuscripts like this, we would not be able to read these comedies. Very similar thing going on in Byzantium. This is a tiny fragment of a tragedy by Euripides of Athens, Helen of Troy. This was discovered at the famous Oxyrhynchus garbage dump in Egypt, in northern Egypt. It's a fragment of Euripides' play. And if it weren't for medieval scribes working in Constantinople, we would not have the entire play. We would have this tiny little fragment. We would not have the whole thing. And this is the copy of the play that is now in the Medici Library of Florence. So the medieval church has been maligned in alleging that it's stamping out theater and joy. But medieval scribes, intellectuals, the people who are actually conveying this dramatic material from antiquity to our bookshelves today have been maligned. And it's also really important to know that, you know, when the Roman Empire becomes a Christian state after the conversion of Constantine, what we see is the successors of this first Christian emperor, and I won't read this particular text, but basically taking care that the theatrical fabric of antiquity, that the amphitheaters, you know, why is there still a Colosseum in Rome? Why can you still go visit, you know, the theater in Pompeii? In part, it's because Christian emperors were issuing edicts that saying that we shouldn't be desecrating these sites, that we should allow them to survive. So you know, it's not even a close look, you know, even a fair look at the medieval archive shows you that there is no attempt on the part of the medieval church or medieval rulers to eradicate theater. Moreover, we can find in the medieval manuscript tradition pretty surprising remnants of the theater of antiquity that most classicists even don't know exist. So it's widely known, for example, that Aristotle wrote the first book of his Poetics, which he dedicated to tragedy. And he promised that he would write a second book dedicated to comedy. And famously, the second book does not survive. And if you've read The Name of the Rose or seen the movie, you know that no spoilers, but the movie revolves around a copy of the second book of Aristotle's Poetics, which exists in this particular fictional monastery and which causes all sorts of trouble. But the premise of Umberto Eco's novel and of this movie is that precisely that medieval monks would have considered a book about comedy to be anathema. And if it did exist, they would do everything that they could to destroy it or have it destroy other people. When actually, I recently discovered, I'm not the person to discover this particular manuscript, but I have published about it. There exists in a monastery in a Greek monastery at Mount Athos, a manuscript which contains an epitome, an abbreviation of what looks like the second book of Aristotle's Poetics, which deals with comedy. So it's not the second book of Aristotle's Poetics, but it suggests that there was such a book, or even if there wasn't such a book, that monasteries were aware that this book had existed, or they were trying to understand what this book would have contained. And this is a little abbreviated version of what the theory of comedy would have been had Aristotle's books survived. And you can see, it compares the kind of catharsis that laughter brings about to the type of catharsis that tragedy would also have engendered. And this is a medieval monastery, so it's so far from being the people who are squashing theater and entertainment in this period. It's precisely the monastic scribal traditions, either of Byzantium or of the West, that are perpetuating this. So this is the same monastery that gives us these sort of beautiful icons that we still venerate from the Greek-speaking East. And this also helps to explain. We have famous to scholars of theater, tragedy, Greek tragedy, called the Passion of Christ, the Christos Paschon in Greek, which calls itself a tragedy according to Euripides. And what this is, it's a canto, it's a patchwork of little bits and pieces of verses from Euripides' drama sewn together to tell the story of the Passion of Jesus, with Mary, his mother, basically performing lines that would have been given to Helen of Troy, or to the other sort of tragic heroines of Euripides' plays. So, again, so far from repudiating Greek comedy and tragedy, what we see going on in Byzantium is its recycling and reuse as a tool for understanding and expressing, in this case, the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And moreover, we see similar embraces of these ancient genres of comedy and tragedy in the West, the copying of the comedies of Terence, a famous text, the Gemma Animae by Honorius Augustudonuensis. We don't know where, we're still not clear where his monastery was. It might have been Autun in France. But anyway, here we have Honorius comparing very specifically the performance of the Mass and the role of the priest as an embodiment of Jesus at the moment of his Last Supper with his disciples. Honorius is this text becomes very influential. Honorius is not, so far from being ashamed to compare the Eucharist to a tragedy. Honorius breathes meaning into the Eucharistic ceremony by comparing it to what goes on in the catharsis of tragedy in the ancient theater. Very similarly, we have a wonderful a sermon that survives from around the year 1200, in two separate French manuscripts. This is a Latin sermon, and you see here that the sermon complains that the preacher complains that normally when he tries to give a sermon and he tries to get his audience to cry over the death of Jesus because it's a tragedy, he can't get them to cry as quickly as if he were telling them about the tragedies of Roland and his death with Olivier at the fatal pass in the Pyrenees that is discussed in the epic, the Chanson de Roland. So again, so far from being scared of ancient tragedy and comedy and trying to suppress it, and here we have medieval intellectuals, theologians, playwrights, artists, using these categories of comedy and tragedy in ways that make sense to them, at the same time as they are actually perpetuating for us the textual tradition that we have. So that's my take on how we put medieval theater into the arc of theater history and exonerate the medieval church from any type of nefarious role of censorship. And yes, absolutely, were there medieval theologians and naysayers who loudly condemn drama, who loudly condemn the Feast of Fools in the church, or who, who prefer that there isn't so much theatrical singing in the liturgy? Absolutely. But the fact that they keep complaining about it means that it keeps happening. So these guys can complain all they want. It's not stopping the actual performance of theater and other types of festivities in the medieval world. Let's turn to what we can learn about medieval theater from the manuscripts that survive, the manuscripts that convey the relatively few scripts of medieval plays. And I'll admit, we don't have a lot of textual evidence for medieval theater. And the reason for that, I have argued, is because, again, in the same way that performers learn their trade from one another, in a world without copyright, the best way to keep your best gags and your best material and your best plays, to keep that intellectual property intact for you as a performer or for your troupe, is precisely not to write it down. So the absence of thousands of scripts for medieval plays is not the evidence for the absence of medieval theater. Indeed, we have to rethink the way we think about the performative role of all medieval texts. My rule of thumb is that medieval manuscripts are crying out to be read theatrically. Even when, so for example, let's take this. This is one of the back leaves of a famous Psalter psalm book, copied in England in the 12th century, and its impresario, its main scribe and artist, is giving us a portrait of himself here. This is Eadwine of Sussex's self-portrait. And at first glance, it looks, like a silent, dutiful, obedient monk sitting at his desk, quietly, preparing his page. He's got his pen and he's got his little stylus, his pen, and this is his scraper. This is how he erases mistakes. But if we look a little closer, we see that this is not a silent page. This is a dramatic text, because here in the margins is a theatrical dialogue taking place. Eadwine is having a dialogue between the scribe and his letters. I am the prince of scribes, and neither my praise nor my fame will die. Shout out who I am, my letter. And then the letter shouts back, by your writing, you are he whom this figure represents. Fame proclaims you to be Eadwine, living through the ages, whose genius the decoration of this book demonstrates. This is a particularly wonderful theatrical example, but the fact of the matter is that most medieval texts were created to be read aloud, to be performed. And not just texts that appear to be theatrical, texts that look pretty darn dry on the page or in the archive. But what they need is our, like these little spongy pills, they need our imaginative juices to reanimate them. So here's some like rules of thumb that I've come up with for imagining how we bring medieval theater from the margins, like it's been censored by the church or stamped out. Let's bring it from the margins into the world of the potential. And one of these rules of thumb is just, practically speaking, even performances, plays, songs, dances, and you'll hear about this tomorrow, the difficulty of studying an embodied art form like dance. Even those performances recorded in writing just are not apt to survive. Actors are notoriously hard on their scripts. All the scripts that I have from my days as an actor are in absolute tatters. The most utilitarian documents that survive to this day are hanging by a thread. I'm showing you here a wax tablet, which is called the Novgorod Codex, which was just discovered in 2000, just 20 years ago, under this medieval boardwalk in what is now northern Russia, which has expanded by 100% everything we know about writing in Novgorod in the year 1000. Or here's a little papyrus leaf that has not been protected by a binding and is in the process of disintegrating. So even if actors were in the habit of writing things down, which I submit they didn't usually do, But even if they were, the likelihood that these practical objects are going to survive is really small. But there's a reason why most of the medieval manuscripts that we have in the great libraries of the world are beautiful deluxe texts between bindings that were carefully kept, as opposed to things that were like put under people's beds. Or we have rich evidence that plays are being performed, but we have no evidence that those plays were scripted. So for example, here's a lovely tantalizing passage from a book that has nothing to do with theater. It's the Deeds of the Abbots of St. Albans. It's a chronicle kept of this powerful monastery, one of the wealthiest, most powerful monasteries in medieval England, which tells us a story about how a particular guy called Geoffrey de Gorin, he had meant to come to St. Albans to teach the monastery school there. He had come from Normandy, but he got there late and they'd given the job to somebody else. So he opened his own school at a nearby village called Dunstable, waiting for the school at St. Albans to open up. And while he was there, he decided to perform some plays with his students. And he borrowed some vestments from St. Albans to beautify the play. And they did the play about St. Catherine, right? But they don't, but why do we even have this in the Gesta Abbatum? Is because the sequel to this is that Geoffrey performed this play about St. Catherine, which may or may not have had a script, with his pupils, and the night after the performance, his rooms caught fire. I guess there was a fantastic cast party or something. His rooms caught fire, and all the vestments that he had borrowed from St. Albans burned up. And so he offered himself, as the chronicle goes on to say, as a burnt offering to the monastery. He becomes a monk, and he eventually becomes the abbot of St. Albans. But the only reason why we even know about this is because this adorable little anecdote about the guy who becomes the abbot is included in the Gesta Abbatum. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know that this had happened. Okay. Even texts that do tell us about performance don't always tell us much about what was going on in that performance. They don't give us stage directions. They don't give us musical notation. All of the rich things that make performance leap off of the page or off of the stage are not included. So one of the oldest surviving play scripts of medieval Europe, and also one of the oldest surviving texts in Castilian Spanish, which I'm showing you here, this is it, right? Not very fun to look at. Never know this was a play if you were just paging through a manuscript. It's copied on the back leaves of a book that is a liturgical text from Toledo. It's a play about the Magi, so it would have been performed at Epiphany. It's written in Castilian Spanish, but it doesn't tell us who says what lines. If you look closely, you can see there are these little symbols here, which seem to be direct, basically these are aides memoire. This is the point where you move around the church. This is the point where, the one Magi says this, the other Magi says this, but this was also sung, but there's no musical notation. So basically this script, again, it's a memorandum. It presupposes that the guys who normally perform this play, they know this play. And this is just in case they need a little refresher. But it's, for us, if we wanted to reconstruct this possibly amazing liturgical drama with music and costumes, not helpful, because that's not what it was meant to do. It was just meant to be an aid memoir. We also have to be very liberal when we think about what constitutes performance, what constitutes medieval theater. There are plenty of types of performance that existed in the Middle Ages. Again, a world without theaters, which means, it doesn't mean that there's no theater. It means that any place could be a theater, and we just have to be thinking about how that place is operating as a theater. We can find theatrical texts all over the place. They just happen to be, they don't look theatrical. So a great example is this pathetic looking little legal document, which exists among many hundreds of medieval deeds and charters at the Harvard Law Library. It looks like nothing, but actually it's crying out to be performed, because this little piece of parchment, which has been stuck in the slot here, this should be a place where a seal goes to show that this is an authentic charter, but there is no seal. So this charter doesn't look very authentic at all. So instead, what this little piece of parchment is doing is it's screaming out, this charter is the best charter of all the charters in this monastery, even if it doesn't have a seal. So, it's performing its legitimacy here for us, because that's all it's got. That's all it's got left. Performances, or the texts of performances, are likely to lose or gain performative features in the process of being written down. So if we relax our expectation that everything theatrical is going to get written down, what other kinds of information are we gonna find? So, for example, a particular medieval playwright called Adam de la Halle, who was also a composer. He was the first vernacular composer to compose polyphony in French as well as in Latin. And he is the author of a number of poems and lyrics and dance songs, rondeaux, debate poems. And he's also the author of a bona fide musical. This one is actually not so much musical, but it's a comedy called the Play of the Bower, or the Play of the Folly. And it survives in this beautiful deluxe manuscript. And here we see a nice miniature of Adam talking to his audience and saying to them, Seigneur, savez pourquoi j'ai mon habit changé? Seigneur, do you know why I've changed my habit, why I've changed my clothes? And this go on to read the play. The entire play of this drama is only in this one manuscript. So again, it's hanging by a thread. If this manuscript had not survived, we would not know that Adam de la Halle had written this play. But we have a scene from this play, the very first scene, this exact same scene, in another older French manuscript, where you can see that it's lost all of its beautiful illumination. It's lost its character designations. We don't know who's supposed to say what. I've argued that the reason why these things aren't filled in is that this play, which in the context of being performed in the city of Arras in the 1270s, is a very specific play about current events. It's like an SNL sketch. I've studied this play for years. I still have no idea what's going on in this play. But here, one scene is being lifted out of the play and anonymized so that it could be performed by anybody on any occasion. It doesn't have to be performed in this particular town and be about the local issues that are going on in that town. So it's losing the specificity to become more portable. That also means that performances that are more adaptable are more readily able to survive in writing. Adam, there's only one manuscript of this play, which is about Arras in the 1270s. Nobody else cares about this play. And we're just darn lucky that somebody actually managed to copy it into a manuscript. This also means that, think about your favorite musical score, or your score of Hamilton, or your copy of Shakespeare's plays. It takes a lot of expertise to lay out a play in a format on a page. And, if it's accompanied by music, that takes a lot of expertise. It takes a lot of scribal expertise. And again, with this particular playwright, Adam de la Halle, we're really lucky that because he was a composer of polyphony, which necessitated the invention of an entire type of musical notation, mensural notation, which is the kind that we have now, which not only gives you the exact pitch of notes, but also shows you how different lines of music move along together. Because Adam composed this very sophisticated kind of music, his plays benefited from that scribal expertise. So the very fact that you had to have really good scribes who knew how to lay out a manuscript and do musical notation to do this. So this is another play of Adam's, which is a musical comedy called the Jeu de Rodebert et de Marion, the play of Robin and Marion. The technical demands of recording this drama, make it easier for the scribe to use those same skills to lay out this play in this beautiful way. But again, remember that, think back to that play of the Magi Kings, right? It doesn't have any of this, none of these bells and whistles to help us, because it assumes that we already know it. it assumes that we already know what this play is about. And then finally, and this is kind of back where I started, specific instructions that are included with texts of performance are often attempts to codify an existing practice, establish a template for future performers, or even to limit the way that performers perform. Sometimes plays, sometimes the artifacts of theater are restrictive. They're trying to shut down too much theatricality. And this is really what Ethelwald is doing, right? He's saying, okay, we're going to perform this drama, the Quem Quaeritis, the Visit to the Sepulchre on Easter morning, but we're going to do it nicely, guys. We're going to do it quietly. We're going to shave beforehand. We're not going to have our beer bellies sticking out like those guys in the sculpture from Germany. We're going to be walking slowly, and we're going to be performing demurely like women. We're not going to be boisterous. So this is what Ethelwald is trying to do. This is not the beginning of medieval theater. This is the attempt to put an end to a particular type of boisterous performance. So medieval theater is not actually born out of this one little liturgical seed. Medieval theater is pervasive. This is an example. But if we start opening our eyes and ears and other senses, we get a much bigger archive. We get a much richer way of thinking about theater. And again, we can think of all sorts of reasons why a particular community might not want to script its own individual performance practices, because that's what makes that community unique. We have a wonderful record of this process. Orderic Vitalis, who is a prolific historian, he's one of the best sources we have for the history of Anglo-Norman England and Normandy in France in the late 11th and 12th centuries. There's one part in his monumental history where he tells us the story of how it's called, he tells us how a new historia was invented for his abbey, the Abbey of Santa Vul. And the word historia in medieval Latin doesn't just mean a story or a history. It means a liturgical office. It means a drama. It means any kind of storytelling. And so basically the process is that the community of Santa Vul, which has been recently refounded, so it doesn't have a lot of rich liturgical history, it wants to build up its own theatrical traditions. And so, as Orderic tells us, the abbot of the time asks a famous cantor, a guy called Arnulf at Chartres, to compose a new feast for the abbey's patron saint of Vul. And Orderic tells us that Arnulf ediderat this new liturgy. He pronounced it. So he didn't write it down, he didn't script it, he composed it, and he pronounced it. How does this liturgy, which Arnulf is composing at Chartres, get to Santa Vul? So Chartres and Santa Vul are a couple hundred miles, well, maybe not that many, maybe like 100 kilometers apart. Two young monks, because they have good memories. They are sent from Santa Vul to Chartres, and they listen to Arnulf sing it over and over again, and they learn it by ear. And then they bring it back to Santa Vul, and they teach it to the other monks. And the other monks continue to perform this liturgy composed by Arnulf for 60 years before it's finally written down. And it's finally written down only because a new monk joins the monastery who's from Paris, and he knows enough musical notation to be able to put it down in writing. Otherwise, they would have just continued to sing it the way they normally sing it. So this is the other thing, is that we think about drama as, we think about theater as, again, we think it needs a theater. But of course we don't. We're living in a postmodern world in which our understanding of theater is so much closer to the medieval understanding of theater. It's an understanding of, we know about street theater. We know about Zoom theater during a pandemic, right? We know about people who have been performing whole dramas, on their using TikTok. We know that theater doesn't need theaters, and medieval people knew that too. This idea that theater has to happen in a darkened building on a stage is a very weird modern idea. So we are closer to getting it than a lot of our predecessors were. Theater can happen anywhere. And then, of course, theater comes out of a community. And I think that was where I was going before I kind of got excited about street theater and Zoom theater and stuff like that, which is that, a conventional way to think about theater is that a playwright writes a play, either because he's commissioned to write a play, he or she is commissioned to write a play, or he or she has ambitions to get this play produced, they write a play. And then the play gets taken up, gets commissioned, or gets optioned, or it's a film score. It gets optioned by a studio or a theater, and the studio hires a director, and the director casts a bunch of actors, and the actors learn the script by heart, and then they perform it. That's the opposite direction of the way that theater happens in a medieval world. Theater starts with the community. What is the historia? Think back to Santa Rule. What is the historia that the monks of Santa Rule want to tell? And they find someone to crystallize that story for them. This guy Arnulf, who's such a brilliant singer and composer, but he composes hourly and orally. He doesn't compose on a piece of paper. So theater starts with the community story. What does the community need to convey? And then actors are found who emerge out of that process. So it's a real reversal of the way we used to are thinking about how performance gets created. But again, it's so much closer to TikTok, YouTube videos, the kinds of stuff that we see kids doing in playgrounds, the kinds of like, hey kids, let's put on a show. That's much more medieval. So, getting out of our heads, the narrative of medieval theater, the idea of what medieval theater is, has been bookended by two unfortunate assumptions. One, this assumption that medieval theater should look like the theater of antiquity, or that it should look like the theater of the 16th century onward, a theater which is enclosed, a theater like Shakespeare's Globe, here in Southwark on the banks of the Thames, a theater which you have to pay to get access to. So there's a whole new economic model involved. A theater that has to be licensed. You can't perform a play in the Globe unless the Queen's stationer tells you that you can. So there's a lot of censorship involved in early modern theater. So that idea of the enclosed theater of the early modern period is another unfortunate kind of teleological model that we need to sort of get rid of. So if we looked at London, this exact same landscape, in the 12th century, so 400 years before Shakespeare was even born, we see a medieval chronicler, this guy William Fitzstephen, who's one of the first biographers of St. Thomas Becket. And in fact, he writes this description of London as a prologue to his saint's life of Becket, because Becket was a proud London boy. He'd been born in London. And Fitzstephen uses this opportunity to advertise to all the readers of Becket's life what a great place London is for theater. And by theater, he means going to church, worshiping God, feast days, giving alms, receiving guests, betrothals, marriages, merrymaking, bear baiting. He goes on ice skating. There's this huge litany of things. And he says, in addition to all these types of sports, and this is the Latin ludi, which also means plays, we don't have theater like in ancient London. We have saints plays, we have other types. So for Fitzstephen, all of these things, playing ball, going ice skating, bear baiting, hanging out with your neighbors, all of these things are ludi. All of these things are plays. All of these things count as the theater of London. And indeed, if we fast forward to the heyday of Shakespeare's plays, to an amazing 2-volume printed book. This was written by the antiquarian John Stowe, A Survey of London. And Stowe was, look at his birth dates. He had grown up in a world, a pre-Reformation world of London. And he actually quotes that passage from William Fitzstephen that I just showed you. He quotes it with approval. He quotes it with nostalgia, because he then goes on to tell his audience, these or the like exercises have been continued until, and he means this, almost until our own time. In other words, he's saying, I'm quoting to you this 12th century text because that was the London of my boyhood. That's what theater was like. Theater was merrymaking and bear baiting and hanging out with your buddies and ice skating and all this sort of stuff. But he says, and maybe this is just an old man's peak, but he says, of late time, recently, that is under Elizabeth, in place of those plays, stage plays and other plays, have been used comedies, tragedies, and interludes in histories, both true and feigned, for the acting whereof certain public places have been erected, which open pastimes in my youth, being now suppressed, worser practices within doors are to be feared. So here is Stowe, and this just breaks my heart. This is Stowe saying, oh my God, we've lost the medieval, he doesn't have the word medieval in his vocabulary, but we have lost this medieval theater. We have lost all of those things that William Fitzstephen, he quotes this entire text in his 16th century history. He says, that's the London I knew as a boy. And the London I'm living in now is a London where if you want to go to the theater, you got to go and you've got to pay money, and it's all within doors, and it's nowhere near as good. It's not the theater that I'm used to. So, so Stowe sees the type of communal creativity of medieval theater is in the process of being stamped out by the construction of playhouses, by the early modern state and its bureaucracy, by the censorship of Elizabethan England. And, for example, I'm showing you here a painting of Commedia dell'arte performers in Italy. This is their warrant to be allowed to perform in public. Okay, so here we are in the 17th century. The state is controlling what gets performed. And so they display this sealed document prominently because they want their audience and any of the kind of condottieri or police force that might come in to let them know that this is a legit performance. But why is the theater associated with the Commedia dell'arte never scripted? Precisely because these performers do not want it to be censored. So we famously have no scripts of Commedia dell'arte. It's entirely passed down by word of mouth, by apprenticeship, by training. Because if it was scripted, those scripts could be censored, those scripts could be destroyed. I also want to emphasize that the invention of print, the beginnings of the early modern state, these things do not necessarily eradicate or stamp out medieval kinds of theater. There's a remarkable manuscript which exists in an archive, I believe it's in Bologna, which is a remarkable diary kept by a Franciscan friar over a period of several decades. This was a guy who basically was the Franciscans are preachers, they're preaching friars. He would tour around Italy, and he kept a diary not of what he preached about, but how his preaching went. It's like a record of his own performance on a given day. So he's like, so today it was a useful and excellent sermon, delivered with fervor and a sonorous voice. And it's just like, hey, it was a great performance, right? Okay, today, not as fervent a sermon as I would have wished. I was very bored. I'm sort of like channeling Bernie, like I was bored, but it was badly preached. People didn't come; it was too cold. Reminder: you didn't preach because there was like a civil war going on. It's Italy in the 16th century. There's always a war going on. this was a great day. It was a devout sermon. They burst into tears. Sorry, I'm going all vaudeville here. Again, he doesn't tell us what, All Saints, usual topic. Okay, of course, we would love, theater historians, I would love to know what he preached on at All Saints. Well, it's the usual topic. It's the saints, right? Okay, but you added a lot. Yeah, you did a great, it's like you ad-libbed. You had a fantastic night. It was like amazing. Passion Sunday. This is the pièce de résistance. This is your bravura moment. Passion Sunday. It's the run up to Good Friday, and you love this part because you show a skull to the audience, a memento mori, to remind them of their death. This, to me, first of all, it's just like amazing source. But what an amazing revelation that a skull, which, historians of Shakespeare's theater, and especially this particularly famous scene of Hamlet with the Skull of Yorick, this is almost universally interpreted as the quintessential early modern existential angst-ridden moment, right? That Hamlet is a modern guy, and he's full of all of these dark Dostoevsky-like impulses. What if Hamlet has seen this kind of preaching, or Shakespeare has seen this kind of preaching, and what he's doing here is imitating an itinerant preacher who pulls out a skull to remind him and his audience of their mortality. So this this suggests that we could rethink what the meaning of this moment in Hamlet's play, in the play of Hamlet, is, and how Shakespeare's audience would have received it, given that this looking at a skull turns out not to be a quintessentially early modern thing, but actually is a medieval dramatic technique. And of course, we can celebrate the fact that, for many of us, when we think about medieval theater, we think of the amazing, the cycle play of medieval York. We think about the Middle English translation of the Dutch play Everyman. We think about the morality plays like Mankind, The Castle of Perseverance. And of course, but we have to remember that, especially with the York cycle, these were plays that emerged out of a very specific type of community, a very specific type of urban milieu. The York cycle is performed on wagons drawn by people, not horses, because that would have been way too messy, through the streets of this ancient Roman and now medieval city, which, thanks to the accidents of history, still exists as a medieval city. It wasn't bombed in the Second World War, for example. And this is, at each one of these stops, the same play would be performed 12 or 13 times over the course of an entire day, inscribing the history of human salvation on this medieval urban space, beginning from this imposing gate outside the city of York. At the same time, we have to remember that for much of its history, the York cycle would have been performed in a time of massive civil war, which would have colored the way that, even though we know that the York cycle begins its history sometime in the 14th century, if not earlier, it wasn't scripted until much later, because again, scripting things makes it easier for people to control them. But it also means that even in a 200-year history of community theater in this one particular town, the specific ongoing events around you are going to change and inflect what those particular plays, what this particular theatrical event means at any given moment, depending on what's going on in and around the landscape of medieval York, which has been eerily silent this year because of the pandemic, and that the normal, the recreation of pageants from the medieval York cycle that has been going on in the city since the 1950s, has obviously not happened in the last couple of years. And yet so important was the collective memory, the nostalgia for this type of medieval theater in the post-war community of medieval York, that it was eventually revived. And I won't stop to go through all these slides, but I love doing this exercise with my students where I have them guess why particular guilds in medieval York, particular craft guilds, claimed ownership and bragging rights over the performance of particular pageants of the York cycle, because each one of these advertises the crafts and the skill and the expertise of these particular crafts. That, of course, the goldsmiths are going to do the magi. The barbers are going to do John the Baptist because he's a great advertisement for why you need a good barber. He hasn't shaved in a long time. Plasterers are creating the heavens and the earth. The armorers are creating the flaming sword. The shipwrights, of course, are doing Noah, etc., etc. So these are plays which are absolutely embedded in this particular moment of medieval community. And unfortunately, the late 15th century script, which survives of these pageants, is missing at least one pageant, the Creed play, because that play was censored under the Protestant regime of Elizabeth I. We have documentation of this. We have the mayor of York writing to the dean of York Cathedral saying, can we perform this play, which seems kind of Catholic now? What can we do? And they're being told, no, you better not perform it, because now in this happy time of the gospel, how the state will bear with it, I know not. And we don't have that play anymore. Of the 40-some plays in the York cycle, we don't have the Creed play. It was clearly considered just too dangerous even to have it in the script. And as I mentioned, though, luckily, because of the surviving urban fabric of this particular medieval theater, York, which as a city is a theater unto itself, and the survival of these plays meant that in the immediate post-war era of a very impoverished and depleted Britain, the revival of the York plays, beginning in 1951, has continued to become a renewal of this type of modern or postmodern community around these medieval dramas. And of course, not incidentally, launching the career of one of our most beloved actresses. This is the 15-year-old Dame Judi Dench playing an angel in the Nativity play. And here's a more modern example of one of these York plays. So I'm going to conclude by saying that I hope I've convinced you that we need a different narrative of what medieval theater is, what it consists of, the various ways, the places we can look for it in manuscripts, in public spaces, in communities, in churches. We can release ourselves from this narrative of the destruction of ancient theater in the Middle Ages and the suppression of laughter and joy and entertainment. And we instead have to rethink the relationship between this, I would say, broader theatricality of the Middle Ages and the ways in which that type of medieval theatricality does seem to be suppressed by the forces of the early modern period and state building, bureaucratic, administrative structures that are so such a significant part of that process. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Carol. What a perfect way to start out our amazing series. Just such a great way to kind of open up all these questions about medieval theater and performance in general. So thank you so much. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and I encourage anyone who is interested to go ahead and type in your questions, and I will go ahead and read them out so that Dr. Symes can answer them. So if you're willing, Carol, I will go ahead and read the first one from Elizabeth Berkey. She asks, was it local cultural ideals of propriety or church, in parentheses, sexist, edicts that prohibited women from acting on stage? Or did women, in fact, act on stages in some locales?
Great question. So there's a wonderful book by Susanna Crowder. And I'm now blanking on the name. It's called Performing Women. And it takes the same very broad definition of theater and traces women's performances and women's patronage of theater in the medieval city of Metz, which is now in Belgium, I think, over a period of several centuries, and shows how women are playwrights and impresarios and actors in this particular locale. So that's one really concrete example. And you know, Susanna can do this for Metz because it has a really, really rich archive. Susanna wrote a dissertation where she basically did like 1,000 years of theater from like the 5th century in Metz till like the 15th century. So for most places, we just don't have that kind of rich documentation. So that's part of my point, right? Is that even when theater is happening, you can't expect that you're going to get the kind of sources that we would want to have. But so that's one point. So if it's, and then I would say, if it's happening in Metz, why isn't it happening other places too, right? We just don't have the documentation. I do think, I am convinced that women are performing very regularly. First of all, we know that there were female troubadour and trouvère poets, songstresses. You know, we have lots of evidence of women as performers of all kinds, of dancers, as singers, of entertainers. We have women, female jongleurs. So they're there, they're totally there. And yeah, I would bet that when you read, and this is where you have to be so careful with legal documents, you know, any kind of legal document that's like, don't do this thing, you know that people are doing that thing. And they're just, you know, but either it's the local priest or the local municipal authorities who are like, don't do that. So I think, you know, unfortunately, many scholars have taken these prohibitions against particular types of performance at face value without recognizing, like, if you're reading the records of a particular town and year after year they say no women performers, that means that women are performing. and we just need to you know, read underneath those documents and find that evidence. Now that can be, I get that that's a little bit of cold comfort, because of course we want to know what these women were doing, but they were doing it. And I think I would also say, because I'm kind of asking us to think differently about early modern theater as actually being more restricted, you know, more regulated. You know, the prohibition against women performing in the professional enclosed playhouses of Europe is precisely about that. It's about, this is a regulated theatrical environment. And, you know, you can go to the brothels in Southwark where there are women, or you can go to the theaters in Southwark where there are men. And now that's very specific to England. Like we know in Paris, the professionalization and closure of theater in Paris does not have the same prohibitions against female performers. So it's very localized. So I think that also the question was great, because it's about, I think we have to think, rather than thinking like everywhere in medieval Europe, it's all the same, church bad, people are not allowed to do stuff. We have to think, okay, what are the conditions of this particular, you know, region or city? What's allowable, what's not allowable? And then be a little bit more imaginative in the way we read the material, the sources, I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, I have another question. This one from Dr. Timothy Graham. Could you tell us how Rotsvit of Gandersheim fits into your narrative? Do you think there is the possibility that she attended performance or at least readings of Terence's plays? Do you think her own plays may have been performed or read out loud?
Thank you so much, Professor Graham. Yes, absolutely. And I have published about a bit about, not on, well, I mentioned Rotsvit a lot, but the answer is absolutely yes. First of all, we know that Rotsvit grew up in the Ottonian court. She grew up in the 10th century in Germany, in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. And we have a fantastic, this guy Otto II, his brother Bruno was a bishop, but he was a really like fun-loving bishop. And in his saint's life, in the life of this saint, Bruno, who was part of this court where Rotsvit would have grown up as a young girl, it says very specifically that Bruno loved plays, and they were always reading and performing plays in the court, and that this is that. So in other words, it evokes for us this environment of theatricality, in which Hrotsvit and her best friend, who becomes the abbess of Gandersheim, I'm forgetting her best friend's name, but this is the milieu in which they're raised, and when they move into this convent, that's the tradition that they take with them. So I think it is similarly the idea that Hrotsvit would compose these Terentian comedies, which also have very significant, which are also about women who are martyred by rapacious Roman emperors and stuff like that. So they're they have a real spiritual meaning. But the idea that she would write these amazing plays and nobody would do anything with them, just does not make any sense to me at all. Especially given this milieu out of which she emerges. And if we fast forward, so Hrotsvit is in the 10th century. I should also say, not only is Hrotsvit amazing, but she is not just the first woman playwright that we know about the Middle Ages. She's the first named female playwright ever. Fast forward 200 years, and we have another amazing female playwright, Hildegard of Bingen, in quite similar region, who is not just a physician and an astronomer and a theologian and a preacher, but also is writing plays and music. And and we know, because there are plenty of people complaining about it, the Bishop of Mainz is like, Hildegard, stop dressing your nuns up in these crazy outfits. So we know that she is performing those things. And we know that because it's the guys in Mainz who are like, stop doing that, So I have real ambitions. One of my favorite things to do is I've written some. You'll be meeting my former student of mine, Kyle Thomas, at the end of this lecture series. And I have translated, I think now 3-4 medieval plays from Old French and from Latin in actor-friendly editions. And Kyle has mounted on stage a number of them. He'll talk about that. But I have real ambitions to do, because the other problem with appreciating Hrotsvit is that none of the translations of those plays are any good. They're not fun. They're not actable, and so they really need their own lively translations. Sorry, that was a tangent. But I think really good translations of those plays would do so much to actually even answering Timothy's question, because it would just kind of just like leap off the page to you that these are super funny plays.
Yeah. Excellent. We have a question from Rebecca Hewitt. She's asking, another instance of, quote, everyone knows that in the Middle Ages, unquote, is a significant number of people could neither read nor write. Is this true, and how much of an effect might or would this have on the recording of plays and other entertainments?
Oh, what's such a great question. So the degree to which medieval people were able to access writing, and I say access, has been significantly underappreciated. Again, this can be we have to think about what does literacy mean. So, because we have a Latin tradition, which is very masculine and patriarchal, and which is the language of elites and the language of the church. And there are a few, famous women, Hildegard, Eloise, we can think of the women who are very, very Latin literate. And not, but there are emerging vernacular languages. But scholarship in the last 20 years has really exploded what it is that we mean when we talk about literacy in the Middle Ages, the different kinds of literacy that people have, and think about the kinds of literacy that we all have, right? I don't have a lot of popular culture literacy. I have, so the fact of the matter is that, if you know somebody who can read, functionally you're literate. If you can, you might be able to read in your vernacular language of, Old French or Middle High German, but you can't read Latin. So, but we also know that, and this is my new project now is very much about this. It's about how do common people, and even not, and especially non-literate people, actually access the textual record. How How do they get involved in the creation of texts? How do they understand what is in the text? How do texts get performed? Because I think that, again, here's where performance is so useful: is if we take it as seriously, the idea that a lot of the medieval texts, legal texts, fiscal texts, why do we call something an audit? Because fiscal texts were read aloud. It's audire. You gather to hear them. So does it matter if you're literate if you go to an audit? No, because someone's reading it to you. So I think in the same way that, so my new project is in a weird way, a kind of a, I don't know what its relationship is with my previous project, but it's a bit like, if not only do we have to think about theater in a bigger way, I think we have to think about literacy and access to documents in a bigger way too. I mean, Mike works on a period of, where of really rich, late medieval Italy, really rich textual culture. But I think that we, if we make an assumption that just because people don't have this kind of elite level of literacy, that they are just being duped by the people around them, I just think that's, plus there's also a wonderful collection I would recommend to everybody. It's called Documentary Culture and the Laity in Early Medieval Europe, edited by Warren C. Brown et al., amazing group of scholars. And what it's basically showing, it goes region by region throughout the early medieval world, and shows how much writing medieval people are doing. And remember, I showed you that little disintegrating piece of papyrus and that coat, that wooden, that tablet. It turns out that, early medieval people did a lot of writing, but they wrote on fungible things. They wrote on cloth, they wrote on birch bark, they wrote on wood, they wrote on wax. So that, there could have been, there's a ton of writing going on. We're just not getting it. There's another wonderful book, Simon Franklin's Writing in Society in Early Rus, which 900 to 1300. It's a wonderful book, in which he reconstructs what he calls the entire graphosphere of medieval Rus, like all of the ways in which people, literate, non-literate, whatever, are encountering writing in their daily lives, and grandmas who have writing on their spindles and knitting needles, okay, maybe they can't read it, but they know what it means. So again, I think that it's just so interesting to think about how is writing, perform, manifesting itself in these kinds of material, embodied ways that people are able to access it. Like I showed you, like that, that Commedia dell'arte performance with the charter. Now, maybe a lot of people in that audience don't know what that charter says, but they know it means that that's a legal performance. They understand symbolically that's what that charter is for.
Yeah, I was just thinking that about how text can be symbolic in that way. So many times in a medieval cathedral facade, there might be text in that facade even, and the person every day walking by on the street may not know what that says, but they do know what it says because the images or because they've been told or whatever. So that's a great.
Absolutely. They know if it's the Last Judgment and Christ is holding a scroll, like they know that this is the souls of the souls of the saved or whatever. Yeah.
Right. I love that idea of multiple literacies. So Jessica Cochran, grad student here, she has a question. Does the oral formulaic theory, Lord and Perry, circa 1920, fit into your understanding of how medieval actors learned their craft without having written materials to help them?
I love that book. We have a competition here at Illinois every year called History Soapbox, 10 Greatest Books, and basically you have 3 minutes to convince the audience that your book is the most important book that's ever been written. I've run this twice. I'm so good. My first time I run it with the Codex, Justinianic Codex, and the second time I run it with Lord and Perry, with the Singer of Tales, because on the grounds that this was, this was a book which proved that Homeric poetry was not written by a guy called Homer sitting at a desk, but that it's a process of accretion and iteration over many, many generations that creates the great epics that we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And a very similar process is happening with the Song of Roland many millennia later. And it also made people take oral culture seriously. That the equation of literacy with intelligence is still a mistake that a lot of people make. I'm sure not this audience. That somehow there is no such thing as a sophisticated culture unless you're literate. Socrates was famously not literate. He was famously against putting things in writing because it destroys your brain. So that book is, I just love it. And absolutely, a lot of the methodology that I developed for my first book on Abbots and a lot of the stuff I've been doing since then is coming out of maybe not so much oral formulaic theory so much as what that teaches us at bottom, and that's a wonderful question, is that the capacity of performers to that memory is not just a mental thing. There's this physical muscle memory too, and the capacity of performers to actually not just memorize, but invent and embroider and improvise on material in performance is really extraordinary. And so we can absolutely kind of take that model, which captures that was Lord and Perry in the 1920s, I think, between the two wars, a type of performance which then gets eradicated. So thank God they were doing that amazing anthropological work, ethnomusicological work. But that absolutely has informed my my thinking about this. There's a wonderful classicist, Gregory Nage, who's used that to talk about other types of both ancient and medieval performance traditions, which I found really, really useful. But above all, it's a book which dignifies oral culture as something every bit as sophisticated and rich and meaningful as textual culture. So yeah, huge. Love that book.
Great. Varda Brahms has a question. In Carmina Burana, which I love musically, the texts are referred to as being sung by bawdy monks. I can get the jokes and laughter and bawdiness were part of people's lives, as you've pointed to, but I've never quite understood how to reconcile bawdy and monks. Can you explain how or when monks were allowed or able to be bawdy, despite whatever mistaken in parentheses assumptions I might have had about who and how monks are supposed to be?
That's such a great question. So the Burana in Carmina Burana means Benedict born. This is a monastery, it's the Latin name of Benedict born. It's a monastery in Bavaria, which also produced, and in the Carmina Burana collection, the songs of Benedict born is what this means, is a number of plays, which include one of the first ever plays that has German alongside Latin in it. It's the Easter play from the Carmina Burana has the Mary Magdalene character before she is reformed, when she's still a wanton woman singing in German. But again, playing to the audience, right? Because it's like, haha, she's singing like in German, like this, like, oh, come look at me, young men, and stuff like that. It's fantastic. So in the same way that we have a lot of disgruntled, municipal authorities telling people that women shouldn't perform at carnival and stuff like that, we have just so many abbots and monastic reformers kind of going, oh my God, just these monks, they have to stop, so many people complaining about my novices, they love reading chivalric romance. Oh my God, my novices, they're composing plays. Oh, my novices, they're always crying over the story of Tristan. So it's happening. Like monasteries are full of, adolescents, and and it's just going to happen. So I think that sure, the point of being a monk is you strive to live a holy life, but you're a human being. And there are the Carmina Burana in particular were composed, many of them, for times of the liturgical year when those constraints were meant to be loosened. Christmas time, the weeks after Easter, the entire Christmas season, so the Feast of Fools is a real thing, the idea that at some point in the Christmas season, usually on the 26th or 27th of December, the choir boys get to call the shots. They get to decide, what happens in the church. And so the wisdom of so much of the medieval liturgical year, and indeed of kind of the monastic rule, was that there's got to be times to blow off steam. And so I think the Carmina Burana is a really rare example of, it captures in textual form the types of festive theater that would have been enabled and allowed even within a monastery at certain particular times of year. And at those times of year when things weren't enabled, again, the picture that we get from all of the complaints of abbots and religious reformers is that when those things are not being allowed, the monks are basically there with the medieval flashlight, under the bed, kind of, reading things like when they're not supposed to be reading them. And, that's what's happening. So yeah, I think there are, I think the other thing that I didn't touch upon enough was clearly something that is different about medieval theater and performance from our own theater is its seasonality. That, whether tied to the liturgical calendar or which is itself tied to the rhythms of the agricultural year, right? Lent makes sense because the food is already scarce. You're already having to fast. You've run out of meat. The spring crops haven't been sown. So, something that we do need to, that what the Carmina Burana captures is that, not all types of theater are happening at all times and in all places. There are times of year where certain kinds of things are allowed more than at other times of the year. And that's something else I think that John Stowe, that antiquarian in London that I was quoting, I think something else he regrets, that now that theater is like this commercial thing and you just go when you have enough money, and all of the seasonality has kind of gotten drained away, that's part of what he's complaining about, I think.
That goes right to the next question, actually, Dr. Symes. Timothy Peterson asks, where he says, I always assumed the performances of the Middle Ages followed the liturgical calendar. Is that a huge oversimplification? So can you kind of weave that in, the idea of the liturgical
Great
calendar?
Question. Yeah, it can be a simplification. I think that a lot of, because the texts of, whether they're liturgical plays or other types of plays, sometimes these texts, very rarely do these texts ever say, this is a play for Christmas, or this has to be a play for XYZ. And one can infer that from the subject matter. Like, the Benedict Boyern, the two plays in that Carmina Burana manuscript are a Christmas play and an Easter play. Kind of makes sense that they'd be performed at those times of the year. But there are other plays which, which seem to mix and match liturgical elements and musical elements that seem to belong in different parts of the liturgical year. And, I think something that's not as well appreciated is that the liturgy was really playful, and that, being a good liturgist meant being able to be inventive. Like I mentioned, this guy Arnulf at Chartres, like he's going to invent a new liturgy for us. Like he's the guy, you go to him. So I'm not, the liturgical calendar is very important. It gives shape to the medieval year and to the devotional year, especially for, for cloistered religious. But, Carl Jung, who was one of the most influential and unfortunately so, I think historians of the medieval church in the 1930s, his theory was that we're still struggling against was that this was very rigid. Like, if it's got stuff for Christmas in it, it's only at Christmas. And if it's got stuff from, Pentecost, it's only at Pentecost. And I don't think that the manuscript record that we have bears that out. But at the same time, what this means, and this is lovely, is that, and Kyle Thomas, whom you'll hear from in a few weeks, his dissertation deals with this, that it means that if you're writing a play or and again, what are liturgical plays, but they're musical theater, and it's not meant to be performed at Christmas, but you're using a Christmas song, it gives you a little hint of Christmas, right? It gives you a sense of that, so maybe the play is about something else, but there's a little musical cue and you're thinking, oh, okay, this is something, in the same way that, we know that when you're sampling music from different musicians and you're trying to kind of create a texture for, for your, your screenplay or whatever, and you hear this little bit, like, oh, that's the Beatles, like, oh, okay, that's meant to make me feel a particular way. Does this mean that, so if we were like, oh, this film must have been made by the Beatles because there's a song by the Beatles in it. No, it means that they're sampling that because it's meant to give you a certain mood. And that, I think, is what's happening in a lot of creative liturgy.
I never thought of that idea of sampling. That's really great. So we're running, I don't know, late on time. We don't have any particular time we have to be off, but I know the hour's getting late for you. There's one more question. Would you mind just answering this one? It happens to be from one of our other speakers, so I thought I'd throw it out to you. Laura, Dr. Laura Weigert, who's speaking, I think, a week from today. She'll be speaking, an art historian. She asks, the figure of the jongleur returns several times in your presentation. Can you talk about your decision to translate the word as entertainer, or tell us a little bit more about jongleurs in Arras?
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Laura. So I wish we were all hanging out together here in Mexico. Yeah, so I mean, I often just leave jongleur untranslated because it's really an untranslatable word. I mean, in French, as learned, it means player, juggler. It captures the French jongleur captures, the kind of performer that I think a lot of performers nowadays would recognize, where like you're busking on the street one day and the next day you got some gig work and the next day you're waiting tables and the next day you're doing this or that. It really captures that. And so entertainer is kind of the most neutral sort of English word that I could come up with for that. But it's really rich, and another French word, trompeur, very similar. It can mean trickster, but it could also mean trumpeter. Like, so these are guys who are like, you need somebody to do something, I'll do it. And actually this is part, and just like an aside, part of the problem of finding evidence for medieval performers in the manuscript, in the textual record, is that if you're looking for people called jongleur or actor or musician or whatever, you might not find them. You might find some guy who's called a falconer or who's called a, this or that. And if you actually looked at a lot of different documents, you'd find it's the same guy. It's the same guy who's being called the trompeur and the falconer. Like, he's like doing it all, So yeah. So they're gig workers, a lot of them, and yeah, so Arras, the city that I wrote my first book, focused on this amazing urban milieu not because it's famous because it was the first medieval urban community to produce vernacular plays, to produce scripted vernacular plays. And the point there is that, just like the example I was saying of Metz, Susanna Crowder's work, every community produces theater in every period of history at all times. It looks different in ancient Mesopotamia than it does in Taiwan, but every community has a form of theater. What was weird about Arras is that they script it. So my book was really about what's going on in the city where they are trying to document this, like what else is happening around this. And it became much more about the richer performance culture out of which these particular theatrical artifacts emerge. What else is going on while the play is going on? Because the point I've been trying to make tonight is that medieval theater always has to be carved out of another space. It's got to be carved out of the monastery or the church. It's got to be carved out of the town square. It's got to be carved out of the manuscript. And the other thing that made Arras so special is that it had a guild, it had a confraternity of jongleurs who had enormous political and spiritual power in that city, and that really turned the idea of the jongleur or the actor as like this, again, another trope, that like actors are outcasts in medieval society and they're buried in unhallowed ground, and blah, blah, blah. No, this is a town where for 150 years, one of the most venerable community and one of the most venerable municipal / religious institutions in the city was run by the jongleurs, and they had their own relics, and they had just amazing. And that does seem to be so. Whereas every community has theater, what was weird about Arras was that it fostered a particular type of performance culture that did get documented, that lent a certain kind of gravitas to a group of people, men and women, who you would think normally would not have any social status, and that is pretty. That was pretty particular to Arras at that time, and then you can read my. This is not a plug for my book, but basically I wrote a whole book just trying to figure out why do these jongleurs how do they actually manage to pull this off, right? And it has to do with the very specific type of politics, culture, economy of this particular place at this particular time. Yeah.
Wow, fantastic. Well, can I just say thank you so much for your generosity, Dr. Symes, and your wonderful, wonderful talk. I am realizing that one of the biggest things missing is the applause that we are all giving you right now. So this is my little applause, but thank you so very much for starting us off in this wonderful group of lectures, and this was a real treat. And thank you to all the audience who has been with us and stuck with us all this time for these amazing questions that you ask. Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll look forward to seeing, I hope, many of you tomorrow evening for Karen Sillen's talk. And you have the last word if you'd like, Dr. Symes.
No, just thank you, Justine. Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's made me so happy to get to talk about a favorite topic with a new audience. And someday I'll get to come to New Mexico in person, and that will be really wonderful. But thanks so much for the honor of getting to open the Helen Damico lecture series.
Well, thank you. We'll look forward to hosting you another time. But see you everybody tomorrow night.